The killing of Hassan Nasrallah is, for many Lebanese, for all Lebanese, and just in terms of the wider kind of geopolitical consequences of the Lebanese-Israeli conflict, probably the biggest and most crucial event, I would say, to take place since at least the 2006 July war that took place between Hezbollah and Israel. And I might even argue since the 2000 retreat of Israeli forces and Israeli-backed forces from southern Lebanon, because Hassan Nasrallah has been leader of Hezbollah since the 1990s, and under his particular kind of stewardship, the party has gone from this kind of semi-organized, haphazard, resistance, relying on a lot of what the West has called, obviously, terrorist methods of car bombings and hostage taking and things like that, to effectively what is now a fully fledged, completely organized paramilitary group backed by regional actors, being able to get its hand on sophisticated communication measures, sophisticated ballistic missiles. It also operates on the political front as well. So Hezbollah has its political wing, which has government MPs and, or I should say MPs and government ministers, and representation within the political elements of the state as well. And so the killing of the person who has basically overseen this massive shift is huge. And not only that, but also in terms of the morale of the group. I mean, the whole 2006 war was almost predicated on the fact of Israel trying to basically assassinate this man. And they weren't able to. And in fact, he has been kind of underground and appears only on via TV, via cable, as opposed to in person for the last 10 or 15 years. I mean, this is the man that couldn't be caught effectively. And it's the speed with which it happened. It's kind of the unexpected nature of it. Everything is kind of created this shock that still reverberates. That's still reverberating massively right now.
And would that be seen as a grand achievement for Israel?
Well, yes, definitely. They certainly, in terms of kind of the PR elements of this conflict, definitely. And you can see that across their messaging, across their socials, from Netanyahu's speech. They're basically saying we've gotten rid of this kind of terrorist that's been causing us all these issues for all these years, and cutting off the head of the snake, etc., things like that. But for let's say like reluctant optimists, people thought, okay, well, you've got rid of you've cut off the head of the snake. You've been able to kind of kill a lot of the top brass of the organizational command of Hezbollah. Is it time for a ceasefire? Is there kind of settlement? Is this when the US, the UN, the West, whoever, someone steps in and we go, okay, time to talk about the new phase? Clearly not, because as of today, there are Israeli troops in Lebanon. Missile attacks, airstrikes are still taking place. So whatever they might say, it's clearly not been kind of, it was not the ultimate objective for them. That clearly has yet to be realized.
Over the weekend, it was suggested that this would be sort of the move that would end any potential conflict, that would counter any need for there to be a ground offensive. But that's now not what we're seeing play out in Lebanon at all.
No. And that kind of just speaks to the leeway that effectively Israel has been granted in the region, whereby there doesn't, every time we think kind of, okay, well, there's call it a red line or a limit or whatever, that kind of once crossed, we are at a point of no return. It seems like that still keeps, that line continues to be pushed and pushed further, right? As I mentioned, you'd think that after being able to quickly and decisively penetrate, for example, Hezbollah's communications network, right, and detonate the pages and the walkie-talkies and these radio devices, which, by the way, obviously, as I'm sure were detonated in the most haphazard, careless way possible, effectively amounting to a war crime because civilians were put at risk without a second's thought. You thought that would be a red line that wouldn't be crossed. And once kind of that demonstration of intelligence penetration was demonstrated, that would be it. And then that didn't stop. And then the airstrikes continued. And then Hassan Nasrallah was killed. And then other commanders are killed. And it just keeps going and going and going to the point of where is the end game? And that's really the question, is for the Israelis who have declared kind of the official war aim being the return of their residents to the north. where is the end game? At what point do we actually sit down and talk about this? Because there's a complete asymmetry of power here. I'm sure through diplomacy, or at least I'm positive through my own analysis that through diplomacy, it is now definitely an achievable goal, but it seems like Israel wants to keep going and no one is stopping it.
The Israeli army is saying that it's still a limited, localized and targeted attack. Is that not how it's playing out?
I mean, I'll be honest and say it's hard to get any information of how it's going on the ground in terms of kind of boots on the ground, who's going where are these targeted operations taking place. One would think that they have identified certain weapon stockpiles or I don't know, operation rooms or whatever it may be, certain strategic locations for Hezbollah which they can target. But still, a ground incursion like this hasn't been seen for decades. And I read something the other day on the BBC website, which rings very true, I think, and I don't want to kind of claim it, but it's when Israel tends to kind of go in, occupy land, it doesn't tend to leave fairly quickly. So what is this whole thing about a targeted operation? I mean, it's literally the same verbiage they used in Gaza. It's literally the same verbiage that Putin used in Ukraine, right? What is, it's such a vague thing, and it allows them to kind of paint it in a specific way. It's this very flexible, vague term, despite it being targeted, ironically. And I think they'll basically use that to their advantage until there is some kind of limit set for them.
Well, I mean, what could that limit look like? Where do you think, at what point, at what limit would Israel stop?
I don't know if I can answer that question. I don't know, because again, if the official aim is to establish a situation of manageable security, allowing their residents to go back to the north, I don't see why that's not already being discussed after so much has been achieved. It seems like it goes beyond that. It seems like they want to, people might argue they want to escalate to a regional war. They definitely want to send a message beyond just, okay, we can get our residents back. It's much more of a flexing of the muscle. It's much more of confrontation with Iran, because obviously the links are there. And yeah, it is very hard to tell. And one must also remember that even before all this, Israel has technically still occupying Lebanese lands, just like it occupies lands that are technically belonging to Syria, the Golan Heights. It does still occupy Lebanese lands, an area called Sheba Farms. And that is part of any kind of long-term settlement and negotiation that needs to take place. So this kind of disregard for the endgame is already there. So what is the endgame? I honestly don't know if anyone apart from the Israeli government can answer that. And specifically, obviously, Netanyahu, who I think we've already seen the surge in the polls for his popularity with this new recent offensive. And there's a lot of kind of internal dynamics that, someone much more qualified to deal with Israeli politics can, I'm sure, talk about further. But we know kind of his personal and political interests in keeping this kind of very hostile, very security-based rhetoric and politics in place.
Can you talk to me about the displacement, the potential refugees or the refugees that are being displaced as we speak? How many people are moving and where will they move to?
So the figures, again, are very hard to establish. I have seen and read that the Lebanese authorities are saying now up to 1 million, which is a crazy amount considering that Lebanon's residents are, again, no actual figures, sadly, but let's say between 5 and 6 million, I think. I would say. And these are all going from the south, either from southern Beirut, the southern suburbs of Beirut, which is kind of seen as a stronghold. But in any case, it's a Shia-dominated area, which is being kind of indiscriminately attacked. They'll be moving north. And the same of the residents that are on the border towns in the south, residents of cities like Sur or Tyre or Saida, Sidon, they'll all be moving north. And in terms of where they will go, also, another thing that seems to be kind of missing from this discussion is that Lebanon, since 2019, has been undergoing this huge, unprecedented financial crisis, effectively, and economic crisis. There is no infrastructure to deal with any kind of, mass movement or displacement, any kind of refugee thing, not to mention the already existing problems that are there because of a huge amount of Syrian refugees. Where will they go? People have been asked to open their homes for them. If they have relatives, obviously, I imagine that's where they'll end up, or in, I think certain schools and primary schools have opened their doors for them. But this is, I mean, this is catastrophic. Internally, there is just no capability. There's no infrastructure to deal with that much displacement and chaos.
If we look to the West, over the weekend, we had President Biden urging Tehran to pull back. We also had Kamala Harris, potential president-elect, arguing that this Hezbollah chief had American blood on his hands. How far do you think that language serves to escalate the current crisis?
I mean, historically, it always has. You know, Hezbollah is described and prescribed as a terrorist organization by many Western countries, and obviously the US and the UK are ones. And we know what that means in terms of kind of a dehumanization of the other. Now, there's no doubt that Hezbollah has American troops or American blood on whatever, you know, whatever the verbiage that is used. There is no doubt of that. But what's being missed is all the casualties that are taking place, all the collateral damage. In terms of the US is now the blood on their hands, you know, the blood on the West's hands. That's also there because we know, especially the US, you know, less so the UK, but especially the US, they have those levers that they can pull to establish certain limits and red lines on the Israeli authorities. And whatever the rhetoric is about talks of a ceasefire, etc., I read literally the other thing, you know, the next minute about an insider source in the White House confirming that the US authorized this ground incursion, for example. What is there for everyone to see is the lack of action, regardless of what words are being said. And the fact is that no limit has been put way before this the kind of Lebanese theater of this conflict. You know, I mean, it's another thing as well that's just kind of forgotten is like there is a whole other problem in Gaza as well that still needs to be handled, and it seems wherever you kind of whatever focus you try and put on it, there is just no there's no push, there's no actual kind of real hard push for any kind of long-term settlement. It's all about kind of this rhetoric, this appeasing rhetoric of, okay, well, we allow it because Hamas is terrorist, we allow it because Hezbollah is terrorist, and then what next? You know, the civilians don't matter, all this displacement doesn't matter. What about the reconstruction that needs to take place afterwards? None of that is being talked about. It just seems the Americans are happy to say, no, not yet. You know, we won't talk about that yet. And obviously they have their own presidential elections as well that, you know, they can say is kind of a distraction.
In terms of what the UK can do, I know you spoke about certain levers that the US and the UK can pull. What levers are at the UK's disposal and what haven't they done that they should do, if anything?
I was going to say, I'm not sure there is anything really, just in terms of the UK alone. And again, you know, maybe someone who's more of an expert on UK politics and foreign policy can speak to this with more authority. But from my view, at least my analysis is the UK has, for whatever reason, lost so much of its influence in that particular region, the Levant, the Near East. And we've seen before, you know, recently the government suspending certain contracts. Firstly, you know, it was evident that this was more symbolic than actually kind of making any difference in terms of Israel's military capabilities. And on top of that, you know, even so that is within the UK's kind of its own capabilities, but relatively speaking on the global stage, even that becomes even smaller of an effect. So apart from, I mean, there are things that they could still do. You know, the UK government still has a voice in the world, and not only that, but there is some kind of coordination that can take place between the US and the UK, and that then lends a strong voice in organizations like the UN, for example, and the Security Council. And you know, I personally would like to see more of that, even if there is no kind of direct on the ground influence. At least there's a difference in the messaging and in the rhetoric. And there's, again, no reason why strong steps towards diplomatic resolutions aren't taking place right now. You know, there have been all these moments at which one can think, okay, now let's talk about the settlement. Okay, now let's talk about a long-term resolution. And it's just, you know, there's just silence there. The silence is deafening.
So I'm in a school in Saida, which is one of the big cities in the south of Lebanon. And this school, like many schools across the country, has been turned into a refugee center, essentially. So in this school in particular, there are 600 families who have fled the fighting in recent weeks from the south, many of them from the villages right along the south, where we know that the Israeli army launched sort of limited operations in the early hours of this morning. So, you know, you walk around this Some of these people have lost their families. Some have lost their houses. Many of them don't have a clue when they're going to go back home. You know, it's a real place of despair, to be honest.
We're being told that it's a limited operation. Is that how it feels at the moment where you are?
It's difficult to say. I mean, you know, I don't think anyone at the minute is expecting the army to reach Saida or Beirut or even any of the southern cities. But I don't think we need to focus on whether or not it's limited, because the human damage done is already vast. You know, the Lebanese government have said it's, you know, nearly 1 million people displaced. You know, this is a country that's already seen a lot of trauma. We've had the port explosion a few years ago, the financial collapse. So whether it gets worse, you know, in terms of the depth or the breadth of the military operation, the invasion, you know, to the people here, it's already as bad as it can get. They've already, as I said, they've already lost their homes. They've already lost their families in some cases. But I think if you see this operation deepen and broaden and become a military operation more like what we saw in 2006 or even 1982, you know, when Israel ended up occupying huge chunks of the south of Lebanon for 15 years, then you're going to see more of this. I think many people here are skeptical that they are going to stop just on these border villages. Many people are skeptical that it's going to be a limited operation. I think the assumption here is that whatever their, you know, whatever the assumption here is whatever their aims are right now, mission creep is inevitable.
Can you talk to me about what you've been seeing over the past few days? So have you traveled down to the south?
I live in Beirut, in western Beirut, in a neighborhood called Hamra. And I think in the last week, a lot of people have come from Dahya, which is, you know, the southern suburbs, which really after that strike on Hassan Nasrallah, a lot of people cleared out of there. We're talking thousands and thousands of people. So on my street in Beirut, there's people sleeping on cardboard boxes on the street. Some of the lucky ones have mattresses. Others are sleeping on the sands at the public beach. You know, I think people are shocked by how quickly this has all happened. And had you asked me a few weeks ago, I would have said, actually, there's a complacency here among the people in Lebanon. A lot of people just thought Israel doesn't want this war. It doesn't want to do a ground invasion. I mean, across the board, that was what I was hearing. And yet here it is happening, not even in slow motion. You know, it's happened almost overnight. We've had this, you know, very abrupt sort of change in the circumstances. So, and I think you feel that now. There's a despondence and people think probably it's going to get worse before it gets better. And that is a big change in the Lebanese psyche. You know, this war has sort of been rumbling on for the last year. But the change now is people know and feel it's going to get a lot worse.
Can you tell me what it looked like in Beirut just before you left? How dramatic of a difference is there in the landscape?
The atmosphere in the country has really changed in just a matter of, you know, 2 weeks. And in Beirut, you just see it. You see the displacement crisis and you feel it. I think there's an unnerve. Okay, to begin with, there was a lot of hospitality. People were friendly towards their neighbors. People from the south, people from South Beirut who were being displaced. But, you know, everyone is worn out. Everyone is exhausted. Years. This is like a cascade of crises, a cascade of trauma. And I think you're starting to feel that mount up. There's a little bit of tension in the street. How long can this go on for? It's absolutely, you know, people are suspicious. You know, I think it's clear that there's been a very significant infiltration of Hezbollah. And people sort of are looking around and you know, the organization itself is trying to figure out, you know, how is Israel able to do this? And I think you feel that on the street, you feel a suspicion. This neighborhood, Dahya, southern Beirut, you know, it's quite dangerous to go there as a foreign journalist, not just because of the airstrikes, but because people are really suspicious of foreigners. They're suspicious of media, and you know, foreign media is the cherry on the cake, if you like. So it's changed what was a really friendly, welcoming, fun city, frankly, to be something a bit more tense, a bit more hostile, a bit more suspicious.
And so we've heard that there's around 1 million people who are displaced. Where are they going? Where are they traveling to?
Most of them are going to the north, to Beirut. Some are here in Saida. I think, you know, the government is really weakened and it doesn't have the financial resources. So it's a case of go wherever you can. A lot of people have family in Beirut. A lot of people have family abroad in the diaspora. So the Lebanese diaspora is sending a lot of money back. You have people being put up in private apartments, people sleeping on the street, as I mentioned earlier. You know, there's still a lot of people in the south. And if this military operation goes deeper, if it goes further, there's a lot more people who could be displaced. And I mean, I don't know if the system is a breaking point. Does it have a breaking point, or can the sort of the empathy and the hospitality of the Lebanese people living in Beirut and wealthier parts of the country, can it just expand? I mean, you would think at some point there's going to be a limit, but I mean, the general sort of equation at the minute is go north. Some people are going to Tripoli, the big city in the north. 100,000 people have crossed into Syria, which I think says a lot about how bad it is. You know, people taking whatever chance they can for some relative safety.
The British government have told any British nationals to leave. There's also been an announcement that there will be a plane potentially organised. Is that that sort of push to, you know, being told to leave? Is that how it feels at the moment on the ground? Is there a sense that you should just leave?
To a degree, I understand that, but look, the British and other Europeans, Americans who live in Beirut, it's a peculiar place, and it's a place where I think everyone who spends time there becomes quite emotionally attached to. And actually, most of the Brits I speak to don't want to leave. And it's not because they're reckless. It's not because they're war junkies. It's because this country has given them a lot. This country has given them great memories, good times, career opportunities, you name it. And I think the sentiment I feel is people don't want to abandon Lebanon in its hard times. So, you know, frankly, almost all of my friends are staying. A handful have left, but generally speaking, it wasn't their decision. They were told to by work or their families. But a lot of the Brits I speak to don't want to leave because they feel it's their duty to stay in Lebanon, you know, through the bad times as well as the good times.